We've decided you're not family anymore. That's what my mom told my daughter, Evelyn, after she flew 5 hours just to be there for their wedding anniversary. They wouldn't even let her step inside. I didn't scream or argue, I just acted. 30 minutes later, they were shouting in confusion and fear. Let me take you back to that day, not too far, just to the moment when I stood under that decorative arch made of fake hydrangeas. I was scanning the driveway for the 6th time in 10 minutes, trying my best to seem calm. My husband Graham was nearby, juggling 2 half-empty paper cups of lukewarm punch, having a quiet argument with our youngest about whether she could take her shoes off. Meanwhile, my son leaned against a folding chair in that preteen way that silently screamed, "I'm not really with these people." And me? I was checking the time again, whispering to myself, "She's cutting it close." Graham suggested maybe her flight was delayed, sipping what might have been the least celebratory drink imaginable. I nodded, but the knot in my stomach had already begun, that strange sensation of feeling both light and heavy at the same time. Evelyn had been so excited. She picked out her dress weeks in advance and even got it dry cleaned. For a college student, that's like declaring love. She packed a small gift bag in her carry-on, a handmade photo frame she custom-etched herself. Her flight was scheduled to land just before noon, and the ceremony started at 2 agag. She promised she'd Uber straight from the airport. "I'll be there, Mom," she assured me. "It's their big day." And I believed her. By 2 agag, sweat was beginning to soak through the sides of my sleeveless dress as I checked my phone every 20 seconds. No messages, no calls, no Evelyn. I found my mother by the back patio, repositioning candles like she was directing some grand drama instead of hosting a vow renewal. Her hair was pinned up in that retro style that always reminded me of old soap operas. My dad stood next to her, clutching a clipboard as though someone might try to steal the vows and rewrite them. I approached them, trying to sound cheerful. "I know it's getting late, but can we wait just a few more minutes? Evelyn hasn't arrived yet. She's probably right around the corner." My mom turned to me, composed, like a librarian. "Oh, she was already here," she said. I blinked, confused. "What?" "She came a little early," my mom replied, brushing away an invisible speck from the tablecloth. "A bit before noon, I think." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because that's what you do when the world starts spinning. "Then where is she? Is she inside?" My dad chimed in as if he'd rehearsed this line. We told her it wasn't the right day for her to be here. The words didn't register at first. "I'm sorry, what?" "She's not really part of the family," my mom said, smoothing the tablecloth again, as if neat fabric could justify their actions. "Not in the same way." "Not in the same way," I repeated, staring at her, waiting for the joke, the wink, the inevitable "relax, I'm kidding." But that part never came. "What the hell are you talking about?" My voice was thin, shaky. "She understood," my dad said. Crossing his arms like that made it final. She didn't argue. She was very respectful. Of course she was. Evelyn had always been too respectful, too composed, too careful not to make anyone else uncomfortable, even when she was the one being torn apart. I couldn't feel my legs anymore. "You turned her away," I said, barely able to get the words out. "She flew 5 hours, paid for the ticket on her own, skipped her roommate's birthday just to be here." "And you?" "We didn't mean anything hurtful by it," my mom interrupted. "We just wanted to keep things simple, intimate. There were 87 people on the RSVP list, but sure, intimate." Graham came up behind me, sensing something was off. I turned to him, then to my kids, then back to my parents. I didn't yell or cry, but something snapped inside me like the thinnest wire finally giving up. We were leaving. I remember the day vividly. It was supposed to be a celebration, but it ended up being a turning point in my life. My mom had thrown a party, and everything seemed perfect on the surface. But inside, I felt a growing discomfort. It was like a nagging feeling that something wasn't right, and it wouldn't go away. I tried to shake it off, but it clung to me like the oppressive heat outside. I finally couldn't hold it in any longer, so I said it. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene. I just said it. My mom's eyes widened, a mix of shock and disbelief. She accused me of being dramatic, but I didn't respond. Instead, I bent down to tell the kids to gather their things. Graham understood instantly. He quietly disposed of the punch, collected the bags, and gave me a knowing nod. We left in silence, and I resisted the urge to look back. The air outside was hot and sticky, like a punishment for daring to disrupt the facade of family harmony. As we stood by the car, my hands trembled as I tried calling Evelyn again. Straight to voicemail. I sent her a text, but there was no response. I felt trapped, holding my phone tightly as if it could somehow explain everything. Graham, ever supportive, opened the door for the kids and then stood beside me, offering silent encouragement. He didn't need to say anything because moments later I received a message from Evelyn. "Are you free now?" It read. I called her immediately, my voice catching in my throat as I asked where she was. Her voice was small, filled with fear, and it broke my heart. She insisted that she was fine, but I could hear the tremor in her words. She confessed that she didn't want to ruin the event by telling me earlier, but I insisted that she hadn't ruined anything. It was them. They had decided she was no longer part of the family, and the silence that followed her admission was heavy with unspoken pain. I asked her where she was, and she mentioned a cafe nearby. Without hesitation, I assured her we were on our way. Graham was already backing the car out of the driveway. I didn't allow myself to cry or raise my voice. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts and made a call. 30 minutes later, my parents were yelling in panic. I had always believed that they were just like any other imperfect parents, not cruel, just a bit insensitive and old-fashioned. They were the kind who would forget a birthday and then hand you some money to make up for it, thinking it was enough. But cruelty? I never imagined it was in their nature until I heard my daughter repeat the same hurtful words I had once endured. I'm not really family. In that moment, everything from my past clicked into place. Growing up as the middle child, I was old enough to be blamed for things, but not old enough to be taken seriously. My older brother Colin was the achiever, while my younger sister Ruth was the cherished baby. I was the in-between, the one who filled the gaps in our family photos without adding any real significance. The signs were always there, in the little things. For birthdays, Ruth received handmade cards covered in glitter, and Colin got cakes decorated with his favorite football team's logo. As for me, I once got a store-bought sheet cake with the wrong name on it. When I pointed it out, my mom brushed it off, saying it was just cake, and not to make a fuss. That phrase became a recurring theme throughout my life, but it was never just about the cake. It was more profound than that. I must have been around 12 or 13 when I first heard them say it. I had made a new friend, Maya, who was bold and different, with her black nail polish and dreams of becoming a tattoo artist. My parents disapproved, muttering about what kind of people her family might be, as if they were doing something sinister instead of simply raising a teenager who liked eyeliner. Despite their disapproval, I continued to see Maya. Then, one Saturday, I woke up to an empty house. I assumed they had gone grocery shopping, but they hadn't. They had gone to the amusement park, the very one we had planned to visit together, and I wasn't invited. Later, through tears, Ruth accidentally let it slip. When I confronted my mom, she laughed and said they just didn't feel like I was part of the family that day. Everyone laughed, even Ruth and Colin, because it was just a joke. That evening, I sat at the dinner table with swollen eyes and a plate of cold hot dogs. I asked her if she meant what she said. She brushed it off, reassuring me that it was just a joke, but I knew better. You need to think about your behavior. That's what she said to me, and it stuck. I remember feeling embarrassed, like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. It was as if I had to apologize not just for my actions, but for being who I was. For years I carried that with me, genuinely believing I had overreacted, thinking maybe I deserved what happened. It's strange how words can weigh you down, how they can shape the way you see yourself. I didn't realize it then, but those words became a part of me, like a shadow that never left. When I was 22, I met my first husband, Aaron. He was different, not just from anyone I'd ever met, but from anyone my family had ever known. He had grown up in the foster system, moving from place to place, but despite that, or maybe because of it, he was the kind of person who brought stability wherever he went. He could fix things, not just objects, but the atmosphere in a room. He cooked meals that felt like home, even when they were simple. But my parents couldn't see past his lack of pedigree. They couldn't understand why he didn't have a family to show off, or credentials to boast about. The first time I brought Aaron home, my dad asked where his family was, as if that defined his worth. I told them he didn't have any, and I watched my mom's face twist with a kind of pity that felt more like suspicion. To them, his story wasn't just sad, it was a red flag. They never said it outright, but I knew they didn't think he fit into our world. Aaron was kind and soft-spoken, with hands that showed he worked hard. He didn't have a degree from a prestigious school, but he had something more valuable: heart. When we decided to get married, my mom pulled me aside and asked me to promise that I wouldn't expect them to pretend it was a good idea. I was speechless, unable to respond without letting anger take over. They came to the wedding, but their presence felt like a protest. They sat there like they were attending a funeral, not a celebration. When our daughter Evelyn was born, she became my world. Her eyes were big and brown like Aaron's, filled with curiosity and a quiet wisdom that seemed unusual for a baby. She didn't demand attention. She simply observed, taking everything in. For me, she was a gift, but for my parents, she was an extension of a decision they hadn't approved of. They kept her at a distance, physically and emotionally. One Christmas, they gave all the grandchildren personalized ornaments. Evelyn's was generic, store-bought, with joy printed on it in block letters. It wasn't her name, and it wasn't who she was. I tried to talk to my mom about it, about how it made me feel, but she brushed it off, telling me not to read into everything. She said I was always looking for fault where there was none. Eventually, I stopped trying to bridge that gap. I realized nothing I said would make a difference. Aaron and I eventually divorced, not because of drama or betrayal, but because we simply grew apart. We changed, became different people with different needs. He moved to another city, but he remained a good father to Evelyn. We managed to co-parent better than some couples I knew who were still together. My parents, on the other hand, seemed to see our divorce as a victory, as if they had been proven right all along. My mom sipped her tea and made a comment about how everyone makes mistakes, but that I had grown from it. It was like she was erasing Evelyn from our history, turning her into a misstep rather than a blessing. Then I met Graham. He was everything my parents wanted for me: stable, funny, middle class, from a town they approved of. He went to college, wore polos without irony, and they adored him. My dad once told me they were proud of me for turning my life around. I nearly choked on my drink, as if my journey was some detour I wasn't supposed to take. It became clear that Evelyn was part of that detour in their eyes. Her half-siblings got their full attention, real gifts, and genuine warmth. Evelyn got polite smiles and last-minute invitations. I noticed the difference, and sometimes I caught her noticing it too. But she never said anything. She just tucked her feelings away like she had learned to do. My sister Ruth started to change once she had her own kids. She began to see the way our parents leaned on me, how they dismissed me, and she quietly apologized. She called more often, invited me to things, and offered to help with Evelyn without me having to ask. She said it wasn't fair, the way things had been, and she was right. We didn't dwell on it, but knowing she saw it meant something to me. Colin, my brother, remained the golden boy. He worked in finance, married someone who called herself classy and sided with our parents and everything. He shrugged off their behavior, saying they were old and set in their ways. I couldn't bring myself to accept that excuse. When my parents decided to renew their vows for their anniversary, they asked us all to contribute equally. I paid my share, not because it felt right, but because it was expected. I remember sending in the photos for the slideshow. I even helped with the playlist. Evelyn was included in the group email, and she was genuinely excited. For a moment, I let myself believe that things might be different this time. They were older now. Maybe they had softened. Maybe they finally understood the difference between parenting and punishment. Maybe now they treated all the grandkids the same. Just maybe. And then it happened again. When I called Ruth from the car, she sounded out of breath, like she'd been running or something. I was confused because she was supposed to be there. They had told me she couldn't make it, but she had been there all along. They lied. I told Ruth, and she was silent for a moment before she spoke again. It was Moira who had said, "That's disgusting." They told Evelyn she wasn't family. Ruth exhaled deeply, and I could hear the disbelief in her breath. I didn't expect her to know what to say, and I told her she didn't have to. I just needed her to know. She didn't respond right away, and when she did, her voice was soft. She said she'd talk to James and they'd figure something out. I hung up the phone and just stared out of the windshield. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a new betrayal, it was the same one, just replaying itself. But this time, I wasn't the one who felt the need to apologize. The entire ride in the car was silent. I didn't speak, and neither did Graham. The kids were in the back, quietly watching something on the tablet, but the volume was so low it was almost like they weren't there. The silence was eerie, like the calm after a storm when everything is still, and you know that nothing is the same anymore. We had just walked out of my parents' wedding anniversary, as a family, in front of around 80 people, give or take a few old coworkers and former neighbors. We stood up, gathered our things, and left without looking back. I kept asking myself over and over, what have I done? And the answer kept shifting. At first, it was like I had abandoned my parents on their big day. Then it seemed more like I had made a point. And then, again, I questioned what kind of daughter would do something like that. But finally, I realized it was the kind of daughter who has a daughter of her own to protect. When we finally got to the cafe, Evelyn was sitting by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of something that had probably gone cold by then. She looked up as we walked in, blinking slowly like she wasn't sure if we were really there. Her eyes were red, but dry. She simply said, "Hi," as if she hadn't just been shut out of her grandparents' lives. Before I could stop myself, I hugged her tightly. Not one of those polite hugs, but a real embrace. She didn't pull away. We ordered some fries and a few drinks, but nobody felt like eating. I don't know how long we sat there in that silence before my phone buzzed. I didn't even look at the screen. I just knew. Graham asked me gently who it was, and I told him it was my brother. I felt my heart sink as I said, "Here we go." I picked up the phone and heard Moira's voice on the other end. She was upset, asking if I had lost my mind for leaving Mom and Dad's anniversary like that. She accused Evelyn of being dramatic, but I knew better. I knew how they were. I had to pull the phone away from my ear because Colin scoffed so loudly. He was going on about how I was blowing up decades of family tradition over a misunderstanding. Evelyn had flown 5 hours to be there, and they told her she wasn't family. Colin kept ranting, asking if I had any idea what I had done to Mom and Dad, saying they were devastated, that they were in tears. All I could think was, good. That stopped him in his tracks. He accused me of trying to ruin the family. I told him calmly that if one person could ruin their big day, then it wasn't really a big day. It was just a performance. I hung up the phone mid-rant, my hand shaking. Evelyn reached over and placed her fingers gently on mine, just a light tap. I looked at her, and she didn't say anything. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Mom. Graham reached for the phone, telling me not to answer, but I felt I had to. Mom's voice was sharp, accusing me of humiliating them in front of everyone they knew. I told her maybe they should have thought of that before slamming the door in their granddaughter's face. She insisted they hadn't slammed the door, telling me not to be dramatic. Right, I said. They just told her she wasn't family and watched her walk away. There was a pause, and then the guilt trips began. I remember it all started with a phone call. I was sitting there, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, and then Ruth called. She was leaving too. I didn't know what to say. I hung up, feeling a mix of relief and fear. A few minutes later, Ruth texted me, confirming that they were leaving. I showed the message to Graham, and he just raised his eyebrows. Evelyn leaned over to see it, and I knew then that we weren't alone in this. We weren't the only ones fed up with everything, and it hit me hard. It wasn't just about what we did, it was about what it meant. We stood up publicly and said this wasn't okay. Not anymore. About 10 minutes later, Ruth and her husband arrived at the cafe with their kids. They looked just like us, stunned, tired, a bit disheveled. We pushed 2 tables together, but nobody really said much. The waitress glanced at us like we had just come from a funeral, which, in a way, was true. I watched Evelyn hand her little cousin a napkin to clean ketchup off his chin. She was so present, like the big sister I never got to be. It amazed me how well she handled everything, way better than I did. Ruth caught my eye, and I muttered that Evelyn was managing it better than me, too. My phone buzzed again with a message from my cousin Mara, who was still at the event. It was a mess, she said. Colin tried to run a slideshow, and everything froze. People were leaving, and my mom was trying to smooth it over by calling it a misunderstanding into the mic. I handed the phone to Ruth, who chuckled into her tea. We just sat there, still and quiet, as the world kept spinning around our rebellion. I kept expecting someone to come and fix it all, but Ruth quietly reminded me that we were always the ones who fixed things. And this time, we didn't. I leaned back, staring out the window, watching as a couple walked by, holding hands and laughing at something private. It struck me that we hadn't ruined their day. They had. Later that night, I got another update. The vow renewal had gone on. Some people stayed, mostly those too polite to leave or too invested in the open bar. When they kissed, the front rows were half empty. There was clapping, but it wasn't joyful or emotional. It was the awkward, obligatory kind, like when someone finishes a slideshow about their vacation to Utah. 3 days passed. It wasn't a long time, but it was enough for the silence to become deafening. Enough time for the invoices to start arriving in our inboxes. Enough time for everyone to pretend it didn't happen until the money became due. I hadn't said a word. Not to my parents, not to Colin, not even to Ruth, who texted me once to confirm we weren't paying. I simply replied, "Correct." The vow renewal hadn't been prepaid, just parts of it. My parents had insisted on doing it right this time, which apparently meant a champagne wall, a roaming violinist, and a wedding planner who talked about statement florals with a straight face. We were each supposed to cover a third, me, Ruth, and Colin. But now the math had changed, and Colin was about to find out. His voicemail came early in the morning at 7:42 a.m. I hadn't even had my coffee yet. He was furious, accusing me of trying to skip out on the bill. He reminded me that we had a family agreement, and I couldn't just walk out on our parents' big day and leave him with the invoices. He ended with a sharp, "Grow up." I played it twice, letting it sink in, then muted my phone and focused on flipping pancakes. Evelyn wanted pancakes that morning. She was still staying with us, her flight back scheduled for the next day. I had asked my professor for an extension, explaining that I needed to be with family. He understood, saying it sounded important. By the afternoon, the panic arrived in person. My parents knocked on my door, looking like they were trying to sell Tupperware. My mom held something in her hand, maybe a folder, maybe a peace offering. My dad looked tense but dressed in a blazer, trying to appear reasonable. Graham offered to get the door. I remember the day like it was yesterday. The doorbell rang, and I knew it was them. My parents. There was a time when their visits brought joy, but now they were just a reminder of everything that had changed. I waved off any help. This was my moment to handle. I opened the door to find my mom with that sweet, almost rehearsed smile, suggesting they just wanted a quick chat to clear the air. My dad nodded in agreement, emphasizing it was especially important with Evelyn. They believed she might have misunderstood something. I could sense they were trying to play it off as a simple miscommunication, but I knew better. They wanted to speak to her alone, and I agreed, calling her down from upstairs. Evelyn appeared calm, her arms crossed, but her expression gave nothing away. She glanced at me, seeking permission, and I told her it was her choice. She nodded, indicating she was willing to listen. I stepped into the kitchen, staying close enough to protect but not intrude. They began softly, as they always did, claiming they never intended to hurt her. They insisted it had been a hectic day, reminding her of their love. But Evelyn remembered the words clearly. She wasn't considered family anymore. My mom gasped, denying she'd said that, while my dad tried to clarify, suggesting it was about close family only. Evelyn remained firm, recalling how she'd traveled hours and bought a dress, only to be excluded from the event. The conversation paused, a silence that felt like an eternity. Then Evelyn spoke with a calm resolve, saying she wasn't angry, just done. Hearing her say those words, I felt a sense of pride swell within me. She had stood her ground. 5 minutes later, the door closed behind my parents. That night, Evelyn sat beside me, her head resting on my shoulder, and expressed how she was done trying for people who didn't reciprocate. I was too stunned by her strength to respond immediately. I admitted to her that I used to be fooled by their words too, but she shook her head slightly, disagreeing with me. That moment marked the beginning of a new chapter for us. By the next morning, it was clear that the smear campaign had begun. Aunt Liz called Ruth, claiming I'd ruined the anniversary over a misunderstanding. Uncle Greg sent me a message asking if I was okay, which for him was as close to a heart-to-heart as it got. Colin was spreading his version of events, complaining that he was left to bear the financial burden of the event, because, according to him, his sisters had lost their minds. Then Ruth sent a text informing me that they'd changed the will, making Colin the sole heir. I replied without hesitation, telling her to let him have it. I was done trying to buy my way into a family that never truly wanted me. There were no dramatic goodbyes or explosive confrontations. Just space, silence, and boundaries that finally felt solid. They could spin their story however they pleased. We knew the truth and had no intention of looking back. Years have passed since that day. We haven't been in contact with my parents or with Colin, and that's remained unchanged. Evelyn graduated last spring and moved back to the city. She's found a job she loves, surrounded by friends who feel more like family than blood ever did. Her cozy little studio apartment is a testament to her independence, nicer than anything I had at her age. She never mentions her grandparents, and honestly, I doubt she even remembers them now. A few months ago, Colin appeared at our doorstep unexpectedly. Graham answered the door while I stayed seated on the couch. Colin looked more than just physically exhausted. He seemed drained. He came to ask if we planned on resuming support for our parents. Apparently, the retirement villa, the travel club, and the imported furniture weren't cheap, and since we stopped contributing, he'd been covering all the expenses himself. Willingly, of course, because they'd promised him everything. The house, the savings, the legacy. Yet it turned out there was nothing to inherit. They'd been living beyond their means for decades, leaving their net worth in the negative. The house was mortgaged to the max, and the inheritance was merely a fantasy, adorned with illusions of luxury. They had deceived him too. After an argument I didn't witness and have no desire to inquire about, Colin left in a rage. The last I heard, he had also cut them off. It's ironic, really. They pushed Evelyn away for not being family, and now they've ended up with no family at all. As for me, I'm doing all right. I chose my daughter, I chose my self-respect, and I would make those choices again. but I wonder, did I go too far or just far enough? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and tap that bell icon